Okay. Cool. Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Henry Coleman. I am not Helena Norberg Hodge. Do people know who Helena Norberg Hodge is? Is that an attraction here that is going to disappoint you that I'm not her? Okay, cool. So, I'll start. Yeah. The economics of happiness is what I'm going to be talking about today. I have an hour and a half, which is a pretty big deal for me. So, Helena was supposed to be coming here. She's been an activist for 40 plus years in the areas that I'm going to be talking about. She's 73 now. She's got some health problems. That's the reason she's not here. It's probably a really good thing that she's not here, given the heat and intensity of it all. So, and it's a great opportunity for me, so thank you so much for having me. The economics of happiness is a body of work that began in Ladakh, which is a northern area of India, politically part of India, but kind of culturally, ethnically, and religiously in many ways, part of Tibet. So Western Tibet. You cross the Himalayas. Has anyone heard of Ladakh? A few people, yeah. Ladakh is pretty interesting because it hadn't been colonized or developed. It hadn't had an economic system imposed on it until 1974, basically, which is when the region was opened up by the Indian government to tourism, to subsidized food coming in from all parts of the world. Basically, the global economy came to Ladakh. And before that, it hadn't been colonized. It hadn't been under British rule. It hadn't, there had been travelers moving through the region from Tibet, from what was then Persia and Turkmenistan and China. It had a lot of trade, but it hadn't been colonized. So it was a culture in and of its own terms, operating by its own rules. And that was pretty unique in 1974. So Helena went there as a linguist in 1974. She was the first Western person to learn the Ladakhi language fluently in modern times. And she was meant to go and write a dictionary, but she ended up staying for 35 years because she saw the beauty of the place, the beauty of the people, the well-being of the people. And what she also started to see is as this new global economy came in, she started to see the advent of all of these problems that we in our society take for granted. Unemployment, poverty, environmental destruction, cultural breakdown, social isolation, mental illnesses, suicide. Not to say that the traditional society was perfect, but all of these trends started increasing when the new economy came in. So the point of the work that grew out of Ladakh is to show us the roots of many of those problems that we're facing globally today, and now more than ever, in the structures of the economic system that's become a techno-economic system. So, while I'm sure many of us care about these problems, many of us are probably doing something actively to solve these problems, even if it's just in our personal lives. But at the same time, we have an economic system which has grown so big and so powerful, it's basically come to dominate culture and society. It's this kind of machine determining the rules for society and culture. In Ladakh, in traditional Ladakh, it was the opposite. And not just traditional Ladakh, but also Aboriginal Australia. Pre-colonization societies, even in England, before the advent of capitalism that took people off the land, enclosed the commons, started brutally killing witches, who were women who had knowledge of spirituality, of nature. Even before that, there were societies and cultures that were determining the rules for the economy. Now we have the inverse of that situation. So we have an economy that's determining the rules for society and culture. So in a way, we call it the consumer culture. But culture is maybe a tricky word because it's not similar to other cultures. Other cultures come out of interaction with ecology. Economy comes out of interaction with ecology. Economy and ecology come from the same root, which is the Greek word oikos, which means home. Ecology means knowledge of the home. Economy means management of the home. They come from the same root, and yet in the modern day they've been totally separated. The economy has been globalized so much that it has nothing to do with ecology, and instead it's determining the rules for society and culture and dominating ecology from a top-down way. So is that making sense, this kind of fundamental difference? Yeah. So when we're talking, when we're talking about the economics of happiness, kind of catching up to where we are in the modern day, the economics of happiness means understanding this economic structure so that we can unmake it. This is a man-made economic structure. We can therefore unmake it and remake economic structures that support planetary well-being, that support human well-being. Often I think one of the biggest problems is that this economy is so big, we almost take it for granted. We can't see that it's not a natural phenomenon. We assume it's evolutionary, right? Do you guys resonate with that? Like, well, this economy has evolved, it's come from human greed. I feel like that's the main narrative that we're told. And it's actually not. It's a machine that's been created by specific policies and specific mindsets. Helena often talks about how, it might seem overwhelming to talk about the economy and to talk about changing the economy. But Helena talks about how it's not as hard to understand this economy, which is a man-made structure that can be kind of deconstructed and understood, as it is to understand how a tree grows. That is far more complex. That is organic. We can't understand that with our minds. We maybe can understand it in another more embodied way, but we can't understand it intellectually. But we can with this system, and we need to. She often says we don't even understand how our toenails grow, as well as we can understand how this economy is working. So basically, the point is, we need to be looking at that economic structure and seeing how it's fundamentally anti-human well-being, and then talking about a shift in fundamentally the opposite direction. If this economy is so crazy because it's gotten so big, we need to talk about making economies smaller. So has anyone heard of localization? Has anyone heard of decentralization, bioregionalism? All words for the same thing. And for me it's very exciting because more and more people are talking about these issues. Or people are using that language to talk about the shift we need to make. So, in simple terms, the shift we need to make is one from global to local. That doesn't mean, giving up on international collaboration. It doesn't mean isolating ourselves. It doesn't mean shutting ourselves off to the world. It means challenging that global economic system that is determining the rules for societies and cultures across the planet, and building structures, economic structures, that support everything else that we actually care about, supporting community, supporting connection with nature, supporting well-being and jobs. That's the other thing. It's not just an ecological argument. We can talk about localization to people who are concerned about jobs. More and more we're seeing that the global economy is destroying jobs. It's replacing jobs with technology. It's replacing jobs. It's moving manufacturing jobs overseas. So you can go into a small town in rural Australia and talk about localization and not receive the same backlash as if you went and talked about green issues or kind of left-right issues, because people understand that local business provides more jobs. Local food systems provide more jobs and livelihoods that are meaningful as well. So we're talking about okay. I'm gonna move into a question now. It's a game. It's actually a game. It's called the Mad Economy game. understanding, so that's kind of what I'm saying, like understanding the big picture of how this economy is working, and then having the ecological literacy and economic literacy to see how smaller economies could be better for everyone. Whether, this system is making life harder for 99% of the people on Earth. That's kind of something that is actually quite exciting. Even middle-class people are having to work longer hours and harder jobs further away from their homes in order to keep up and keep running on this wheel because it's requiring constant growth. So there's an opportunity to talk to 99% of the population. So back to that big picture of what this current economy is, I've got a bit of a mad economy game. Okay, so this is not a competitive game. You don't have to get, whatever. In 2014, the World Bank used which of the following as an indicator of development in Sri Lanka? A, the number of cars on the roads. B, the number of tourists traveling to Colombo, Sri Lanka's capital. Or C, the number of fridges acquired. Hands up for A. Hands up for B. And hands up for C. C is correct. The number of fridges acquired in Sri Lanka was the measurement by which they were measuring development and progress. So what does that make you think? Does it, that is at a fundamental level, that's an imposition of a view of progress that is westernized, techno-centric, urban-centric, and it's assuming that's progress for the entirety of humanity. That's how this economic system is operating because it's so distant, because people who are making decisions are so distant from what's happening on the ground, they're using such abstract measures as that. They're also using GDP. Who's heard of GDP? Probably most people hear it on the news and stuff. GDP measures. Does anyone know what GDP actually measures? Yeah. Gross domestic product. And what does that mean? I heard most of that. I think that was correct. Yeah. Yeah, so basically GDP is measuring how much money is changing hands within an economy. Ladakh is a great example of where GDP was not measuring real wealth. In traditional Ladakh, and still, I should say, I work in Ladakh for 3 months of the year, so that gives me a little bit of capability to talk about it. Yeah. The what? Yeah, and that's why people talk about growing the GDP per year. So it's measuring how much money is exchanging hands. In traditional Ladakh, there was some money, but the majority of the economy, that's like 90% of the economy, was not monetized. So people were feeding themselves, people were creating well-being together, people were providing for their health, providing for their basic needs, clothing, food, and shelter, non-monetized. It was done by community. It was done in community, and it was predominantly self-reliant. So people didn't need to exchange money. It was a culture that was taking care of that. So when people in Ladakh started to be pulled into this urban economy by certain policies, food policies, making food from the other side of the Himalayas far cheaper and undermining agriculture, etc. When people started moving into that economy and making like $1 a day or whatever, that was seen as good for the economy, and that people were doing better off, even though that meant that they were moving in oftentimes from a beautiful, like 3-story white big house, not comfortable or luxurious in the way that Westerners might want it to be, but a beautiful house with land, with family, and with self-reliance and community. moving to a government provided concrete box in a city where they were earning $1 a day was seen as progress. So it's not measuring real wealth. Anyway, moving on. We'll go into that a bit later. Some more. Hang on. Okay. How far does cod, that's my little symbol for fish. That was very clever, wasn't it? How far does cod, fished off the shores of Scotland, travel before it reaches Scottish cod munchers? I was supposed to say Scottish consumers. I don't know why it says cod munchers. That must have been my... consumers is a bit of a horrible word anyway. I don't know. Anyway, cod eaters or cod consumer, cod munchers, whatever. How far does it travel? 1,000 kilometers. A, 1,000 kilometers. Yeah. B, 10,000 kilometers. Yeah, and C, 80 kilometers. Okay. Well, in a way, you're probably all right. There are still different markets. There are still, there are still people fishing for local markets. But in many cases, these big trawlers that are fishing in the North Sea send their catch to China to be filleted and cleaned before it's sent back to be sold to cod munchers. So how is that possible? How is it possible that food from the other side of the world, and this is regular, this in Australia, in Woolworths, is exactly the same. Food from the other side of the world tends to cost less than food from a couple of kilometers away or the farm down the road. So how is that possible? Any ideas? One sec. Any ideas? Yeah. It's cheaper to send to? Okay, so cheap labor. Yeah, so cheap labor is definitely one of the big reasons. Cheap labor, of course, discrepancies in currency. Oh, thank you. There's a microphone there, so that should be helpful. Discrepancies in currency are the legacy of colonialism. If we're producing our food in India or our clothes in Bangladesh or our cleaning our cod in China because it's cheaper there, that's because the colonial global economy, and that's the birth of the global economy, is in colonialism. That's how it was set up. So it's still a colonial economy that is still dominated by predominantly Western corporations, not even Western countries anymore, but Western corporations. So it's cheaper, yes, because you pay less wages. The other reason, and we'll get to this later, is because global trade is subsidized in so many ways. Because it does boost GDP. It is an exchange of money between countries. So foreign direct investment is the key to creating a strong economy in the prevailing narrative of how things work. So we'll get into that more later. Okay, bottled what imported from the West has become a popular luxury product in China? Air? I heard someone screaming air. Yes. Sorry, we didn't get to play the game. Air is correct. It's pretty mental, but of course, because of free trade treaties that are allowing corporations to go and produce offshore and then sell back in Western countries or around the world, not just the West anymore. It's changing, but because of this massive move of industry to the less industrialized world, places like China have become so polluted, and to the extent that people there have decided to buy for 70 or 80 US dollars in many cases a bottle of air from the Rocky Mountains in Canada. And it's funny, it's ironic, it's tragically funny that those corporations that are producing the pollution in China, in many cases, are Western corporations that have moved there and are even felling timber in Canada to produce furniture to be sold in Europe or to be sold in Australia or to be sold in North America. to be distributed across the world. So the wood moves from Canada to China, then the pollution is offshored to China, then the air is flown, polluting more, to China, so that to be sold as a luxury consumer product. It's pretty mental. I don't want it to sound all too depressing yet, because of course the reason I'm here is to talk about solutions. I probably should have made that more clear. This isn't just a let's all get depressed together festival. Maybe, should I keep going with these ones? Oh yeah, just quickly, Iceland imports ice cubes. Iceland imports ice cubes. Hilarious. Fucking fantastic. This is an important one. Globally, the fossil fuel industry receives government subsidies amounting to A, US dollars 0. Following the Paris Climate Agreement, where it was decided to eliminate all subsidies to fossil fuels. B, US 8.8 trillion per year, to be reduced by 10% per year to mitigate climate change. Or C, US $5.3 trillion a year, with no plans of change. A, B, or C? Okay, so we've got some game players. C is correct, which it's not so depressing that it's 8.8 trillion, but 5.3 trillion. Fossil fuel subsidies haven't been mentioned in any climate accord, any COP, the COP 22, COP 21. They have not mentioned the subsidies to fossil fuels. And of course, that's another reason that's making it so much cheaper to shift products across the world and then fly them back. Happens regularly. In Australia, we are exporting wheat and exporting beef and exporting oranges and importing about the same amount of those products. In the US, beef imports are 900,000 tons per year. Exports are like 890,000 tons per year. So in the UK, it's the same. Butter, milk, bread, our staple products are being swapped between countries. Because that, yeah. Who or what is providing the subsidies? Global governments. So, which means national governments, which mean, what do you mean? Huh? Taxpayers. Taxpayers are providing that. So, that's the funny thing, is that food in Woolworths or clothes in Target are cheaper because they're produced on the other side of the world. Cheaper price tag, artificially cheaper price tag, because our taxes are going to subsidize those products in many ways, subsidizing infrastructure for global trade, subsidizing the expansion of ports, subsidizing fossil fuels, subsidizing mega highways, subsidizing, and then of course the environmental externalities, the cost to the environment, not shown in the price tag, obviously, things like this. So we're paying for these things 2 or 3 or 4 times, and that's why they're cheaper, because policies support that. Why do policies support that? We have a corporate-controlled de facto government of global corporations and banks. Does that sound like a conspiracy? No. Good. We now have, thank you. We now have free trade treaties that are allowing foreign corporations to sue national governments if they do anything that gets in the way of, if the governments do anything that gets in the way of that corporation's profit-making potential in the future. So a Swedish nuclear power company, a Swedish energy company sued Germany for 3.7 billion euros after Germany decided to phase out nuclear power after Fukushima. Because the priority has become economic growth. The priority is, well, you need to ensure that your investment is safe in this country. It makes sense. It's not like these, again, it's not a conspiracy in the sense that there are a group of men in a dark, smoky room talking about how to destroy the world, right? it's a structure that's just gotten so big, and there's so much blindness, and there's so much narrow-minded econometric thinking embedded in it that that people are just doing what they think is best, you know, and doing what they think will ensure their livelihoods. So it's become a system that is, you know, it's an evil system. It's a system that's grown out of colonialism. It's a system that's grown out of slavery, genocide, witch hunts, you know, criminalizing land-based cultures, destroying land-based cultures in a multiplicity of ways. And you know, even in the 70s and 80s, global development agencies were carrying on with colonialism in the form of structural adjustment and debt. So that means IMF, World Bank were going into countries that were poor and saying, we'll give you loans if you open your economies to foreign investment, if you put your taxpayer money into subsidizing the expansion of ports for export-oriented production. We'll support you if you privatize your industries, sell off your assets. So it's become a more subtle form, but more insidious, more powerful form of colonialism. And yet, okay, I've been talking about the depressing stuff for too long now. I find that incredibly empowering. When I saw the Economics of Happiness film, of which I have a few on the table if you guys are interested, the Economics of Happiness film showed how our environmental issues, our social issues, you know, loss of jobs, our economic issues, our psychological issues, because of the breakdown of community and, you know, various other things, are interrelated. So those issues, we too often see, without looking at this big picture, we too often see these issues as separate and often opposing, you know? It's either well-being and jobs in our rural communities, or in, you know, creation of jobs and creation of industry and economic growth, or the planet. And so that's why you see, without this big picture being a well-known kind of picture, without this big picture really being at the front of people's consciousness, people are dividing across these issues, and we're seeing the rise of fascism that hates environmentalism, and we're seeing the rise of identity politics that ends up, in many cases, not in all, but in many cases, squabbling between themselves, or hating the cultural other, or hating the conservative, or whatever, not seeing there's this bigger picture in which we're all, our interests are really all very closely related. So that's why now, you know, I really think is the time, if ever, to be spreading that big picture awareness and building a movement for fundamental change, because there's room to get people on board from all different camps, from your environmental camp, from your people who are concerned about the growth of wealth inequality, people who are concerned about Woolworths moving into their community and shutting down smaller shops, people who are concerned about mental health. Of course, this system is one that perpetuates insecurity at a personal level as well. It tells you you have to consume to be a valid person. It tells you have to have a certain image, a certain look, a certain lifestyle, especially young people, you know. It's telling us this all the time, relentlessly, through advertising, which is being invested in like trillions of dollars per year. It is working, even if we don't think it's so, you know, obvious to us. But it's telling us, it's seeding us with the message that you're not good enough unless you are this, unless you have this, unless you look like this, unless you are famous, unless you are a celebrity or whatever. You know, it's undermining self-worth at such a fundamental level. It's leading to all sorts of mental health problems, and of course, because it undermines community. The structures of community are based on economies that bring people together. You know, it might sound kind of boring to talk about the economy all the time, but in a way, the way we get our food, the way we provide for ourselves and our loved ones is at the heart of, it's at the root of cultures, it's at the root of communities, it's at the, you know, it's, you know, really we think that that's kind of like, if we're going to talk about structural change, we need to be talking about economic change before anything. And so the kind of economic change we're looking to is decentralization, localization. we need to be building up movements at the same time as getting involved in grassroots projects that are about rebuilding the fabric of local economies. Because in those local economies, people can come together and see that they have much more in common than they have differences. You know, in a time where fascism is on the rise, we really need to be getting out of our camps and talking to each other about and having time for each other, people with different political opinions and things like that. In a local economy, you can do that. You can also see where the production of your food is coming from. You can see the farmer who is running the show. You can talk to the people who are making your clothes. And that creates so much fulfillment. It also builds the prerequisite for genuine diversity. So the law of life is diversity. The law of nature is diversity. Everywhere you go, you know, every tree is different. Every leaf is different. And we need economic structures that respect that difference. If you're selling, go back to food because that's at the base of our economy. If you're selling food to a local market, it's in your economic interests to diversify your production, right? To be selling a bit of, a few carrots, basil, tomatoes, maybe some eggs, some whatever. In the global economy, these mega structures run by algorithms demand a massive field of straight carrots that fit the machinery, or round apples, or bananas with a certain curve, a certain length of curve that fits the supermarket shelves. And it's anti-diversity, it's anti-life. It's creating monoculture, which means huge use of resources, use of land, water, chemical, pesticides to grow in that unnatural way. So at a fundamental level, localization, which is about restoring the economic structures that support diversity, is the only way to provide for ourselves in an ecologically sustainable way. Is that making sense to people? I'm going to have a bit of a drink of my coconut water, and if I would really appreciate if anyone has any points to add. Is there a microphone? Thank you so much. If anyone has any points to add, or questions, or concerns, or criticisms, please, please, please bring them up, because it's actually way easier for me to talk in conversation than just like this. I mean, I've never really done this before, so please, please add whatever you need to. Hands up, I guess, and have a drink.
I was just wondering what you think of getting rid of state governments and having like a federal government and then just your local councils, and do you think it's going to be something that happens?
What do you think of it first?
I think it's a great idea.
In why?
Because I think you do need a federal government, but I also think that local communities should be more dealing with their own issues rather than...
Yeah, totally. We definitely think that political decentralization comes after economic decentralization. If you, say for example, a community in Australia decided it wanted to be fully autonomous and didn't have anything to do with the state or federal governments anymore, and just like that, just decided that's what it wanted to do, in a way it would be in a weaker situation in terms of the global de facto government of corporations and banks that would be able to target that community more easily. It's kind of like what happened with Brexit in a way. The UK government chose to remove itself from the European Union, which in a way is not always a bad thing. The European Union is also wedded to corporate growth. It was from the start. But on its own, without a proper articulation of how to economically localize as well and provide for people more self-reliantly, it is going to be more in the pocket of American corporations, because at least the EU was a bit of a buffer, and because it had the influence of smaller democracies like Sweden and Norway, not Norway, but Sweden and Finland and other countries that were smaller democracies, it has a bit more of environmental sustainability and stuff. But so it was able to be a bit of a buffer. But at the same time, like I think, in terms of your question in Australia, the federal government is so wedded to corporate interests. Like I've had friends in the youth factions of the Conservative parties, in the youth factions of the Labour Party, and they say at the grassroots people have good ideas, but once you climb up too high, the lobbies are so powerful that you can't get anything good through. So it has to be, that's the other thing about this big picture, it has to be beyond left and right as well. So if we can kind of economically localize and build movements that can tell governments, that can tell federal governments and put pressure on federal governments to listen to what people want rather than what foreign corporations want, then that could be great. But we need that, you know. We really need our governments to be listening to us before corporations. And I feel like that's the crux of the issue. Yeah. Someone here?
Yeah, thanks for that answer on that. That kind of captures one side of it. And I just wanted to comment on one more thing.
Well, thank you, yeah.
From an activist position, the further away a power structure is from the problem, the harder it is to be active and create change. So if we got rid of state governments, we would be creating a power structure further away from us. If you want to lobby, you want the power structure to be close enough so that you can be at their office. You want to, you know where they live. Yeah.
Well, that's why local governments around the world have been able to institute policy that really is radical in terms of relocalizing. They've been able to support local procurement strategies where hospitals and prisons and schools get their food from regionally before anywhere else, and they've been able to support craft and craft markets that have been able to restore rural livelihoods in various places, Australia, India. I know of a few examples. Local government is far more easily influenceable than, but at the same time, they're still so at the mercy of the bureaucracies that they're involved with higher up. So state is far more corrupt, and then federal is far more corrupt in terms of corporate interests. And I feel like I'm no expert on this. You probably know much more than me, but I feel like that shift has to come from the grassroots. We have to be influencing local, and then we have to be networking nationally and talking about this big picture nationally in order to have a place at the arena of federal government, which can then finally, we actually need to be working on that big scale as well, even though it's hard, and even though it's kind of against what we're talking about in terms of localization. But we need to be, in order to pull out of free trade agreements that are distorting our economies so hugely, and in order to create policy that supports those local economic structures. And often people say local economies are elitist, are more expensive, less accessible, and of course in the current climate they are, because they're not receiving that policy support from top down. So at the same time as people are, I shouldn't say that, they're not all elitists. That's also a kind of a perception that's been peddled by by corporations in many ways and by those interests. But what was I saying? We need to be, what was I saying? Forgot. Anyway, moving on. Yo.
I have a question. Please excuse my English. I just arrived 2 months ago in Australia. I have the question. I know a big movement, Slow Food, for example. It's a very huge group that is also working politically.
Yeah.
And is doing big lobbyism work in Europe. Very great work also. What for groups are there in Australia that you can support to make a change? And I really recommend. Want to make an appointment to Slow Food for everybody, because it's really a big movement there supporting small farmers all around the world.
Yep.
And they are doing a lot of education work and demonstrations and a lot of pressure of the politics in a good way.
Yep.
What for groups are there? What is possible in Australia to?
So maybe other people can add to this, but the permaculture movement grew out of Australia. Probably not as political as slow food, but has gained so much grassroots support, and farmers markets have been on the increase like that around Australia. So there are these grassroots movements, but thank you for bringing up slow food. Internationally, there are more inspiring movements than we have at the moment here in Australia that are more political, I should say. So like slow food is a great example. Has anyone ever heard of Via Campesina? Has anyone heard of Via Campesina? No, okay, so it's the biggest movement in the world. It represents 400 million small farmers worldwide. It grew out of Latin America, but is across the board now. It campaigns for food sovereignty and supports smaller farmers in a number of ways politically, and campaigns at the international level to do so as well as the local. So that's the other thing about this big picture, is we're not hearing about what's going on in the world. So we may feel really hopeless because we're not hearing about Via Campesina and slow food and even, I don't know, the 5-star movement in Italy. Have people heard of that? There are basically, there's degrowth in Europe, which is huge in Europe. Degrow the economy. The language is in a way questionable, because how can you reach people who are concerned with their economic livelihoods talking about degrowing in the current mindset? But it's a big movement that's attracting a lot of kind of more left or progressive support. There are what other movements am I thinking of? Buen Vivir in Latin America. Lots of movements going on around the world that we should be hearing about, and we're not, because they don't make it into the corporate media. They don't make it into the corporate-owned media. Slow food doesn't make it into the corporate-owned media. In Australia, permaculture has also spread to other parts of the world. Transition towns is another movement of that is in Australia as well. Started in England, but is also in Australia, in parts of Europe, in India. There is so much going on, and my organization, which is called Local Futures, started by Helena, we're in the rare and fortunate position of being involved in networks that can tell us about these movements all the time. We get emails every week telling us about new things that are happening. Even in China, there's an incredible community-supported agriculture initiative just north of Beijing, in a village in Beijing, and it has like 1,000+ families involved. It's one of those grassroots projects that's about getting back to the land, growing together. So we're hearing about movements, new ones every week, that are going against the grain of the corporate economy, that for reasons we've earlier talked about, is pushing us structurally towards these big kind of global institutions in which we feel isolated and which we don't feel politically empowered. And yet, across the world, there are movements that are pushing in the other direction. We need to be hearing more about them. So part of what what Helena calls, what we call big picture activism, is getting the word out about those movements and those grassroots projects that we can get involved in. There's so much happening. We need to be educating ourselves on that, as well as about the big picture of the economy. We need to, zooming out and taking that perspective also can show us that there are so many initiatives, even, not necessarily consciously, but intuitively, about the need to rebuild community, about the need to reconnect to nature, about the need to strengthen local economies. And they're coming to it out of common sense in many ways. So we can see those trends when we're looking at the system as kind of global to local. If we're framing it in that kind of global to local way, I think there's a lot of, sorry, suddenly nervous about getting taken pictures of. What was I can't remember what's on this PowerPoint really. Does anyone else have something burning to say?
I'd like to say, brother, thank you so much for getting up there. Appreciate your courage, man. I know it's your first time, and you're doing a great job.
Thank you. Thank you
I
so
think
much.
that's a round of applause right now for him. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Wow. That's so meaningful. Thank you.
Okay. And the question I have is there anywhere where these ideas that you've mentioned that are being practiced within Australia that you can suggest to us, just to get our ears pricked up, and maybe we can, wherever we're from, in Byron or somewhere, that you can mention to us now?
About like
Some of these
grassroots initiatives?
Yeah, just some things where they're being practiced, and there's that application has net results already, and then we can, you know, feed into that.
So that's right down the road, right? Yeah. So I feel like,
Can we say that so everyone can hear?
yeah.
There's a store in Beaufort, everybody probably passed it unless you came through Lexington, which is doing local produce, they're doing local crafts. So all the food, she said, I had a chat with her a couple of days ago, she said was, she tries to source everything from within 100 kilometers if she can. Yeah.
Awesome. So I feel like people could just start calling out things. There is so much, like community gardens in Sydney. I joined a community garden when I was 15, and that was a huge educational experience for me, learning actually about how to grow. Not taught that in school. So local education initiatives as well are all over the country, you know? Kind of community-based schools, or more like nature-based schools. Even like bigger educational experiments. In the Northern Rivers, I'm involved in a project called Wild Space, which is about getting community together and talking about these issues. So there's localization for food, there's localization for business, there's localization for education, there's localization for, there's farmers markets, I think 750 around the country now. There wasn't any 15 years ago or something like that. But anyone else, any other suggestions? Yeah. Whoa, big group.
Thank you
Cool.
for sharing all the
My pleasure.
I do want to just make a point. I come from a marketing background, and everything that you were saying in terms of like consumerism and corporate growth and the way that they navigate. I think one of the biggest takeaways in my undergrad was when a lecturer told us that he would never repeat himself outside of the room, but the best way to sell anyone anything was to target them with shame and guilt messages. So in terms of like reclaiming and activism and even localization, the first place to start, in my opinion, is with yourself, and actually just like the move of radical self-love and tapping into your own desires and your own needs.
Yeah.
So that was just something I wanted to share with everyone here. And then the other thing, my burning question is, do you have any ideas about ways to measure economic well-being other than GDP? Do you have any kind of countermeasures that you would maybe propose that we can move forward through on a global scale?
Cool. So I'll talk about the first part of your question, or your comment first. That self-love is, of course, really important, and we can start to practice that, of course. And then when we're talking about the economics of happiness, we're also talking about structures that can support that, structures that can support self-love. So when you are more involved in a community, even just a small, farmers market or whatever, but community can go far deeper than that, and we really need to let it. But that's a fundamental antidote to that, comparing myself to distant images on social media or on mainstream media, and feeling shit about myself and all of that. So if we can reconnect in local communities, that can help us do that work, because we can see, and it's how it was in Ladakh. There were no celebrities. We can see everyone has their strengths and weaknesses. And then we have a far more realistic expectation for who we are and who we can be. So instead, as well as that self-love, which is basically pushing against the grain of this flood of what you're saying, corporate advertising and stuff, we need to regulate that on a massive level, you know, if we can get through to politics, regulate that kind of advertising, and also before that, build structures that we can feel validated in because of our personal connections and our relationships to each other and to the natural world. The second about the measurements. I'm no expert on measurements. Of course, there's the GNH, Gross National Happiness, that was started by the King of Bhutan. Bhutan, by the way, measures as one of the least wealthy countries in terms of GDP, but they have or maybe recently, but they do not have the same abject poverty as India, which scores better on GDP, or China that scores better on GDP, or America, or Australia that scores way better on GDP. The same kind of abject poverty just doesn't exist, and it's similar to the story of Ladakh. So GNH, Gross National Happiness, they were measuring other things like work and leisure time, cultural connection, you know, how much time you have socializing with people, involvement in festivals and things like that as well. They're measuring that. So true. I wonder how that has been influenced by the GNH policy. GPI is another one, Genuine Progress Index, that has had experiments in Australia, in many different countries in the world. But the other thing about it is that if we start to rebuild genuine wealth that we can see within our own communities, we don't really need this abstract measure that's telling us how wealthy we are. And the other thing about a localized world is that we can make decisions for ourselves, you know, regulations that we should be able to make regulations that apply to our local economies, and measure things in the ways that we want to. And the closer you are connected with people and the soil and a culture, the more accurate you can be. So even with GNH and GPI, if you're still measuring it on this kind of large scale, there's gonna be flaws, you know. And we should be trying to move away from that in a way. Yeah.
I just wanted to really reinforce something that you said, and something I've seen a lot in my mild activism on both the liberal side and the Labor side. Come from an economics background, and what you said in particular, and this is a point, it starts at politics. It starts at economics and not the politics. So, and I'd like to give you an example that I've been thinking of for the last 5 minutes, and hopefully I can explain it really well. So, if you're concerned with green energy, for instance, and obviously if you want to buy green, it's going to cost more because you're resourcing it from places that don't have all these lobbying and incentives given to them. So you're going to be paying more. And that starts and then you sit there and you're like, well, I can't do anything because I can't afford to pay more because I don't have the employment to do so. And so you don't actually feel like you're contributing to society because you don't have the work. And I'd like to also bring to your attention that the way employment has been measured for the last 20 years has changed. You may be aware. So you only have to work 1 hour a week to be actually classified as employed. So when you look at the employment statistics, if it says 5.6% unemployment, that to qualify within that stat, you only have to actually work 1 hour per week. So I think a lot of people focus more so on the politics and not the economics, because if you actually fix the economics, you empower people to make change through the actual system. And that's a big problem I've seen on the whole political spectrum, is everyone is focusing on the philosophical issues, but not seeing that it actually derives from the way our society is actually built and the structures, fiscal structures within that. So I'd just like to bring that to everyone's real attention and invest some time in it and learn just a little bit about how that all works, and then develop a concise opinion, and hopefully you'll be able to contribute and spread the message as well, because I think this is a really important message. It's one that's, from what I've seen, free from political bias, and I've seen a lot of talks on economics through both my degrees on YouTube and lectures that all have a political bias. So I really applaud you for that, man. You're doing something fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Cool. Thanks for your point. Yeah, I think it is really important to be, practically speaking, we need to be moving beyond left-right politics. The whole idea of left versus right, nowadays it hardly means anything. You vote for left, you're voting for neoliberal corporate-friendly policies. You vote for right, you're voting for neoliberal corporate-friendly policies. And we're arguing about, it's like madness, and we feel that, and of course that alienates so many people from politics, which is a real shame. But along that spectrum of socialism versus capitalism, or communism versus capitalism, even that spectrum, we need to move beyond that, because even that is seeing society as a kind of mechanical thing that can be engineered, that's simply a question of market versus state. And of course it's not. That's the triumph of the mechanical view of things, that is not natural. It's assuming that the economy is a structure under which everything else falls, and that's not true. The structure under which everything else falls is ecology, is Mother Earth, is the planet, and the planet itself is diversified. So we're not going to get one. We're not going to be able to plot every economy on a simple line of left versus right. We need to be looking at real, genuine connection, and the commons, the household economy, which of course has been marginalized since the beginning and led to a kind of new form of patriarchy, whereby and there's a great book about that by Silvia Federici, which is about it's about the witch hunts and about how oppressing the feminine knowledge, oppressing the natural knowledge was a way in which we transitioned into a economy that was not land-based anymore, and it was the birth of the capitalist economy in so many ways. And yet in Ladakh, in traditional Ladakh, I'll go to that again because it's the one that I know. They had markets, they had money, they had some forms of what we call capitalism, and they also had some kind of structures that we would not be able to classify on that spectrum. They had collaborative economies where people brought their animals together and had and took them to the mountains on a kind of rotational basis between in the community. That can't be plotted on that spectrum. You see what I mean? Like, community interdependence and self-reliance are far more important than market or state. And the other practical reason why we need to move beyond that dichotomy is because so many people are voting for right, because more and more voting for the right because and criminalizing the left, or the left is criminalizing the right, and you're never going to be able to build a movement that is big enough if we're still talking about those traditional binaries. So that's why the language of global to local, we hope that can reach far more people, because it can show us what we have in common is far greater than what we have separately, whether identity politics or whatever. So I feel like I'm going to move on with this PowerPoint. I can't really remember what comes next. I told you about that one. Progress, questioning the idea of progress. Okay, this is another bit of a game. So progress, yes or no? By the way, what does progress mean? What do we mean when we say progress? What do we mean when we say progress? Huh? A better future. Yeah. So like and what does a better future mean? It can be a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And yet we see this word thrown around like it means the same thing all the freaking time. Progress this, progress that, progress, So there are a few questions up here. What constitutes progress? One of them at the top is GDP rises. We've already had a conversation about that. Maybe in some instances it does mean progress, maybe in some instances it doesn't. Local tourist industry booms. Depend, all of these things depend. Fridge acquisition rates rise, like in Sri Lanka. Does that mean we're progressing towards a kind of a techno society that is beyond the constraints of nature? And is that genuine progress, or is progress about getting reconnected to those things? So it really depends on what you mean, right? I think this is an important and somewhat philosophical. I apologize if it's too philosophical. The meta-narrative. Our society has a meta-narrative which tells us, which offers us legitimacy through the anticipated completion of a as yet unrealized master idea. That idea of progress. So getting to a better future, what does that mean? Where did we come from and where are we going? A point A and a point B. And this meta-narrative has basically determined the rules for this economy for so long. And maybe just turn to the person next to you now and see if you can outline those two, answer those two questions in the way that mainstream society, mainstream thinking does. Does that make sense? Or is that really wacky and no one understands it? Yeah. Okay, cool. So, where did we come from? Our society might say we came from, the past was brutish. We were hunter-gatherers. Life was hard and dirty. And where are we going? We're getting cleaner. We're transcending nature. We're going to Mars or whatever. We're going on the Elon Musk ship, all to Mars. And that might. I feel like, simply put, that is what we're talking about when we use that word progress in the conventional sense. Does anyone disagree with that? Does anyone have anything to add to that? Because the next thing that I want to do is really get people to use their political imaginations. I think one of the biggest things that keeps us from making genuine progress towards a goal of our own, a goal that's determined by ourselves, a future that we want, is that we don't believe it can happen. We are so, because if you vote left or right, you get the same. It's so kind of all-consuming, this idea of economic growth and transcending nature and going to the moon, that we almost don't see any other way out of that, and we don't see any other future. If you watch a Netflix, if you watch a show on Netflix or a Hollywood movie, you've basically got two options, that's talking about the future. You've got two options of what the future are. It's either, flying cars and spaceships and the, leaving the planet, or it's the system doesn't exist, it's failed, and we're all left in complete nothingness and apocalypse. So it's either the continuation of the system or nothing at all, right? So we've got ourselves in. I feel like you ask most people, what is the future going to look like? They'll give you one of those cliches, a Netflix cliche, or and I really think we need to be imagining outside of this system. We need to be looking beyond that. So the question is, we need to define our own future vision. And there's the flying cars, just in case that you need that inspiration. We need to be looking towards a future that is fundamentally different and that can fundamentally empower us. That's something that I didn't have until I saw the Economics of Happiness film, which opened my eyes to how we can, solve our problems and get beyond this fucking economy versus ecology, just shit house. What do I think about hypernormalization? I actually found that film more difficult to understand than his other ones. So hypernormalization is it is exactly what I'm talking about, though. It's talking about this idea that it's a film by a guy called Adam Curtis that is recently made, pretty cool. Talks about how politics has been so co-opted in our day and age that that we are just living in this kind of bubble in which we know nothing's real. We know that the politicians are lying to us, and they know that we know that they're lying to us, and yet everything continues on as normal. And I think that has got to do exactly with that lack of radical imagination of the future. Yeah.
Sorry, it is a small step back, but also on?
Yeah, it's working.
But it's also connected to the politicians. What maybe always demotivates the people, that it's so hard to do something against it. But the speaker before also told about the connection between the politics and the economics, and the politics are doing mainly those things what is good for the economy, and the economy, the fuel for the economy is the money. And I just wanted to motivate everybody. We are spending a lot of, everybody's spending hundreds of euros each year, and we should think about each euro that we are spending and get away from the cheap shit, and don't think about if it's maybe somewhere else cheaper or stuff like this. We have always this movement right now, or the mainstream is, okay, where can I get the cheapest price? But somewhere else I'm always paying the price. It's the humanity or it's the earth.
But don't you think?
Sorry that I'm jumped so far back.
No. Fine, let's go there. I mean, literally, I have a loose PowerPoint. Let's go there.
I just want to motivate everybody to think about each euro that you spend. We have the possibility to think about each euro. Not nearly everybody.
Spend your euro as well.
Yeah, think about it.
Totally. The thing is, though, I do think we have to go beyond that vote with your dollar mindset, you know? It's a great place to start. It's a really good place to start and build up awareness, and also it's better for us as individuals to be putting what we want into our bodies and things like that. But we have to be, you know, the economics of happiness is about the structures that can make what's good for the planet the cheapest and most accessible. Because people are, you know, don't you think that people are working so hard these days because of this economy that's making them work so hard that they don't have almost time or energy or money to go out of their way and go against the grain and find that product. And it would be great if we could try and encourage everyone to do so, but at the same time, we need to be building up a movement to change the structures and change the subsidies and the taxes and the regulations to make the farmers market the cheapest and the most convenient and the most accessible for the majority of the population. So instead of changing everyone's mind individually, the economics of happiness mindset, and maybe I've also started to call it the beyond the keep cup mindset, is about how do we actually work with the structures to make that the mainstream, to make it the easiest thing. And you know what I mean by that? And that can seem really daunting. That, you know, okay, so we need to get to the top and influence politics from the top down. My conviction is absolutely yes, we do, because it's to go about changing everyone's minds is not an effective change strategy in the long run. It can be really good, but it needs to go beyond that. That's what we call big picture activism. Is, you know, we need to think about how to build a movement. How do movements get built? I'll come back to you in a sec. Just as with any movement, before there is that reality presented, there's a massive education campaign, which is about getting people to speak that same language, which is about getting people to understand the issues and educating ourselves, about getting ourselves to understand the issues as they are. And it's a big ask, but it's not, like I said at the beginning, it's not impossible. This is a man-made system. We can understand it. We can articulate a way forward that is not that. You know, and I feel like we're in that big picture activism stage. We need to be talking about the big picture to each other in our daily interactions. We need to be an activist every day. Being an activist is not just, you know, having a keep cup or protesting every now and again. We need to be activists every day in the conversations we have with people, in the movement that we start to build together, so that there is enough, finally there would be enough awareness to put pressure, collective pressure on politics, if not even enter politics in a new movement. The 5-star movement is a good example of that. I'll come back to that. You wanted to say something? Does anyone have a microphone? Thank you. This man in the beautiful flowers.
First of all, thank you very much for such a wonderful speech and supporting my friend and supporting you, what you were saying right now. Like first, as a normal human, looking at ourselves, myself, I need to sort out what are my needs and what are my wants. Because all the marketing or all the advertising is trying to create your needs into wants, like your wants into needs.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. No, you're
Wants
right.
into needs. Like
Yeah.
for example, and simple example, how many of you use iPhone over here? Please raise your hands. iPhones, Apple, Apple, Apple. Okay. How many phones are there in the market which are much more cheaper or less pricey than iPhone? The point of the phone is you connect from one person to another. Buying an iPhone or buying a Nokia is not going to change your voice or not going to change your voice or not going to make anything better. It's all your hard-earned money which they are trying to steal it from you.
Yeah. And you know, they're doing that in big ways, in like bigger ways than just consumerism as well. Of course, challenging the consumer mindset is a massive part of it. You know, that point about changing wants into needs is the way that the consumer economy works. The consumerism was invented to keep growing this economy that needs to grow to survive. Of course, this global economy needs to grow to survive. That's its fundamental structure. It needs to create returns for shareholders, to attract more investment. It needs to service debt that is created by banks out of thin air. The money that banks create, the money that's given in loans is now just a number on a screen. It's not connected to anything real. And so the debts that have to be serviced for those loans, these companies have to go out and find that real wealth in the world and extract it and turn it into money so that they can service those debts. So this economy has to keep consuming to survive. And that's why consumerism is a key driving mechanism of it, right? So keep people buying, keep that wheel turning and creating more needs. Localization is a way to fundamentally challenge that. The fundamental need of all humans to be loved and to be recognized is now being turned into the need to consume. That's a way, you know, you need to consume so that you have the respect of your peer group, so that you are someone, so that you feel good about yourself. That's the message we're being told, like we've discussed a couple of times. Getting back into a local economy, into community, can really fundamentally challenge that, because you can get your validation the way we've always got it, from other people, from people we love, from deeper relationships within ourselves, with others, and with the natural world. I hope that doesn't sound too philosophical. It's very real world, you know? Like, there are lots of examples now that show how people in prisons, teenagers that have mental health afflictions are radically improved by having by growing their own food and sharing food with others, or by developing a relationship with an animal, or going on a wilderness camp. You know, there's more and more research around that that shows us that we can meet our needs in that way. And local economies provide the structure that allow that to happen more easily. That's, again, economics of happiness. It's about the structural kind of distilling that wisdom from these real projects and applying it on a structural level. Applying those principles of connection to nature and to others on a structural level. Yeah, is that kind of making sense? That's kind of the underlying message. Someone had their hand up over here. See where we're going.
No, as you were saying that, I remembered something I think I've heard somewhere before. I shop, therefore I am. You know,
Yeah.
Kind of defining your identity and your worth by that. Anyway, I've got a saying. I don't know how original it is, but it sums up for me. Sorry. Something which sums up for me, revisiting what you're talking about the nexus between economics and politics and how to make those transitions. The saying I've got is, craft is a radical act, and what that addresses is the notion of localism. It addresses self-reliance and about emphasizing economy, not really in a sense over politics, but rather a different way of providing for oneself as redefining politics by default of doing that act. So the politics really is addressed in a way different from what you were saying, I think, is that it in a sense bypasses or usurps that power or that necessity for actually engaging with politics explicitly as politics is usually seen, but rather redefining what it is that politics is by virtue of changing the economics.
Yeah, you're totally. I should have expressed that more. The way that rebuilding self-reliance, rebuilding artisanal production, and reconnecting with, rebuilding basically community interdependence rather than dependence on the system is incredibly political, and it is something that we can get involved in immediately. So that's the other really the thing I really want to express is that it's not just about, talking and movement building, it's also about acting. We can be political with our actions immediately. Self-reliance and interdependence, community interdependence, are the enemies of the system. That is what the system, first of all, criminalizes. I'm sure many people have heard of Vandana Shiva and the work that she does in India, basically opposing the the commercialization of the seed being owned by Monsanto, or the seed being owned by Bayer or Cargill. The seed reproduces itself. It is self-reliant, and corporations are trying to patent it by genetically modifying it and basically making it illegal for people to grow their own food. So that is what's happening in vast areas of the world, is that self-reliance is criminalized. So therefore, regaining self-reliance is one of the most political acts that we can do. We are kept in this system because we are dependent on it, not because we want to be here. Most of us, raise your hand if you genuinely want to live in this system. I see no. Okay, cool. We'll come back to you in a second. It will be awesome. I can't wait. So many of us are kept entrapped in this system because we are made dependent on it for our physical needs. We are addicted to it. We are made dependent on it for our emotional. 10 minutes, thank you. We are made dependent on it for our emotional and psychological needs, of course, at that fundamental level that we've discussed. So dependence is the system. There's lots of work. Derek Jensen talks about how this system's relationship with individuals is an abuser-victim relationship, because what does an abuser do? Creates dependence, makes the victim dependent on them, in the same way that this system is making us dependent on it, and that is very abusive in that way. Do you want to share what you love about this system? Because of course, it is simplistic to say it has brought nothing to us. So please. Wait, I can't hear you at all.
Here you go.
Hang on. Oh, we'll get a microphone. Woo!
Hello. Sorry, I just came here. I was just taking the word system globally, in a global meaning. I agree with the sentence you just said, like, about self-reliance. I'm sorry.
No, cool. What were you thinking?
No, I thought you were talking about the productivist system.
Okay.
Like producing more and more food all the time with high yields and everything.
Okay. Cool. Thank you for bringing me. I feel like. Thank you. See you later. Producing more and more food all the time. That is. Are we really doing that? Are we producing more food all the time? We're not producing more nutrition, that's for sure. So the food that we are producing through chemicals has far less nutrition in it because it saps the soil of the trace minerals. It's just replacing it with synthetic nutrition, basically, NPK. And so, exactly. Food wastage in this system is huge because it doesn't fit the machinery. It doesn't fit the supermarket shelves. It's harvested all at one time by a big machine, and in many cases 40%, 50% of the apples have to be burnt because they're not big enough yet and they've already been picked by this blind machine, which is manifestation of a blind system. So people and in India, people were measuring, I'll come back to you, thanks. People are measuring the productivity of the green revolution by how much rice is being produced, or how much wheat is being produced, or how much cotton is being produced. And in doing so, in focusing narrowly on one product, wiping out the weeds, so-called weeds that interdisperse that, and fruit trees and different levels, we have studies that show that diversified agroecological systems can produce up 3 to 5 times as much food regularly, even up to 10 times as much food than an industrial monoculture, because you're intercropping, because you're not wasting the food in these mechanized systems. So even perceptions like that, we need to challenge. We need to address some of the basic assumptions we have. Although maybe most people here already don't need to address such assumptions. But anyway, thank you for bringing that up. That's really valuable. Who had their hand up just then?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Cool. Yeah. Cool.
Wrap up, summarize.
Yeah. Let's go one more question, and then, whoa, it would be great to, let's keep talking after this on the dance floor and stuff. But one more here. And if you could help me summarize or put me on a track to summarize, that would be great too.
Hi there. Hi everyone. I live in Sydney, and I'm really disturbed about the amount of advertising that I have to look at every single day when I get about my day. Do you know of any movements or any groups that are trying to ban public advertising from big companies? Because it's, do I have to move to the country to not have to look at it? I think I'm going to find it there as well. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you might know better than I do, or maybe someone here knows better than I do. I'm sure there are movements that challenge that, but bugger up. Adbusters and things like that. I don't know if they're in Sydney. I would love to know. Maybe when. Well, go, please start something. That would be awesome. There is so much going on around the world. That's probably one of the key messages. And in summarizing, there is so much going on around the world that is both radically moving away from this system and trying to get these regulations through, and so many grassroots things that are making life better for people where they are immediately. And what we need is, the basic message is we need a kind of eco-literacy, economic literacy and ecological literacy that can, and to spread that awareness, understanding how this economic system is working, and understanding how economic systems can work within diversified ecological settings. And how we can make that shift is by building that awareness first and foremost, and using the language of localization or whatever you like, but using different conversations to talk to people. And that's something we can practice. Think of someone you don't agree with or whatever. Pretend you're them. Put yourself in their shoes. Surely their interests are also in moving in this other direction, because it is best for 99% of the people on the planet and the planet itself. We have a huge opportunity for big picture activism for an economics of happiness. I'd also like to say I've got some leaflets if you're interested in the organization I work for. You can take one of these. I don't know, I'll put them maybe just at the front here. We have on our website a lot of initiatives from around the world that are happening. We don't have them all. There's too much for us to keep up with. There's also Helena's book, which for me was life-changing. The film, which was also life-changing. If you're interested in exploring these issues more, I really encourage you to look at some of these. The book is fucking fantastic. It really, shows the connections in the context of Ladakh, which is where this all kind of started. Last thing. Yeah. I totally agree with that. And I would take would take it further and say not only in our capability as consumers, we need to rediscover our capability as citizens. We've been so depoliticized by this hyper-normalized, saturated, neoliberally saturated world that we don't believe that we can make these decisions anymore, that we can influence politics. We're so put off by the craziness of left and right being exactly the same and bickering all the time about nothing. We need a new kind of politics that is about engaging as citizens in building a movement that can reach a whole range of different people, allies that we didn't know we had, and come together for fundamental change, for a vision of the future that is exciting, that is innovative, that is about diversity, that is about respecting life, that is about a kind of rediscovery of cultural and individual uniqueness as well. It should be liberating, it can be liberating, and we need, at this stage, where we're at this stage, is we need that people's movement to, it's not about just going into politics. If you just go into politics, you get consumed by the same system, attacked by media, whatever. We need to be talking with each other, maybe networking on social media, but meeting up and talking face to face as well about these things. Be an activist in your everyday life by talking about this shift, encouraging a spread of eco-literacy, ecological literacy, and a movement for localization, and that is the economics of happiness. So on that point, yeah, I think my time is up. I can't believe I have got through that. Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for being here. It really means so much to me. Thank you.